In front of 3,000 Americans at a political rally in Washington, D.C., Bondi pointed at Captain Ibrahim Traoré and shouted, "Go back to Africa." What happened next didn't just silence the room, it shook an entire nation. What kind of man turns public humiliation into global reckoning? And why are millions now calling him the voice America refused to hear? Washington, D.C. February air clung to the streets like frostbitten silk, cold, dry, but electric with something unseen. Beneath the amber haze of Capitol Hill's glow, a long line of sharply dressed guests snaked around the marble colonnades of the Jefferson Liberty Forum, a private venue but tonight the epicenter of a national broadcast. Inside, spotlights carved slices of white across a packed auditorium. American flags flanked the stage, enormous LED screens looped stirring clips of bald eagles fighter jets and quotes from the Founding Fathers. The orchestra of patriotism was in full swing. The event was billed as Guardians of the Republic, a night to defend our values, a high-octane rally funded by conservative think tanks and quietly underwritten by several multinational corporations. But no one in the audience was thinking about money. They were here for red meat for fire, and tonight fire had a name. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Bondi Thunder. Applause, whistles, even a few stomps. Pam strode on stage in a crimson blazer, blonde hair immaculately curled, a 1,000-watt smile trained for the camera. She didn't wait long to attack. "We are at a turning point in history," she began, voice sharp as glass. "Not just because of inflation or border insecurity, but because of foreign manipulators who think they can walk into our democracy, dictate our values, and shame us for loving our own country." The crowd roared. Flags waved. Phones shot upward to capture her face like pilgrims reaching for revelation. And tonight I will not mince words. I'm going to name one of them. A man, no, a puppet master who parades as a freedom fighter, but whispers in the ears of our youth, poisons the minds of activists, and dares to criticize the United States from within our borders. Gasps. Heads lean forward. I'm talking about Ibrahim Traoré. A sudden silence, the kind that falls when a name is dropped like a stone into a still lake. This so-called leader from Burkina Faso, who has made headlines for standing up to the West, has no business on American soil. He is here not for diplomacy, but for disruption. Not for dialogue, but division. And I, for one, say it's time for him to go back. Cue applause. Predictable. Cameras panned across the crowd until they stopped at a man who did not clap. He was seated near the middle, blending in with a small group of international observers. Older, maybe mid-50s. A charcoal fedora tilted over his brow. A simple brown overcoat, nothing flashy, but his posture, precise, too still. The camera flicked away, unaware it had just panned over the very man she had named. Ibrahim Traoré sat with his hands folded, eyes half-lidded. The tip of his thumb rhythmically tapped the inside of his palm, 1 beat per second, a small tic he'd developed in interrogation rooms years ago. His breathing was shallow, controlled, monk-like. He wasn't surprised. He had expected this. She took the bait. From beneath the lapel of his coat, a hidden earpiece clicked. "Transmission clean," came a voice. "Feed up link confirmed. Collecting crowd telemetry now. Her handlers are in row H4 seats from right." Traoré didn't speak, just a nod imperceptible to the human eye, but enough for the voice in his ear. The speech went on. Pam pounded the podium with righteous fury. "He says he wants justice, but justice is not lecturing the greatest democracy on earth. We are not his enemy unless he makes himself one." More cheers, more fire. But Traoré was no longer watching her. He was watching the audience. The way they responded to her fear, not her facts. The gleam in the eye of a suited man texting rapidly. The subtle nod between two women wearing defense contractor badges. He saw what most couldn't. He saw coordination. And deep inside, something ancient stirred. Not anger, not revenge. Resolve. As the crowd rose for a standing ovation, he stood too, not to clap, but to slip quietly out the side aisle. He passed a camera technician who didn't even register him, past a security guard whom he greeted with a gentle evening. No one stopped him. Why would they? They didn't yet know who he really was. Hours after the applause faded, and the stage lights cooled, the real business of the night began. The venue had cleared, but behind its grand auditorium down a quiet corridor, guarded by two ex-military contractors in plain suits, a small room buzzed with low voices and polished smiles. Thick mahogany paneling lined the walls. A single glass decanter sat on a side table next to a silver tray of untouched bourbon. Pam Bondi entered not as the firebrand speaker of minutes ago, but as a shrewd negotiator's shoes clicking sharply against marble. She wore a different smile, now the kind used in boardrooms and backrooms, not ballrooms. Inside, 5 men waited. Their suits varied in shade but not in purpose. Gray, blue, black, the uniform of control. None introduced themselves. They didn't need to. Pam knew them all by code names, not first names. Monarch, Drake, Milo. Men who represented conglomerates that never put their logos on the front page, only their influence. One leaned forward, adjusting his cufflinks. Pam. Solid work tonight. You framed him well. She shrugged, removing her coat. It's not hard. Americans hate being told they're the villain. A chuckle. Short, measured. The man across from her pulled out a file from his briefcase, sliding it across the table. Inside, satellite images of mining installations, shipments logged at African ports, pages of blacked-out financial transfers. Here's the problem, he said, tapping the file. Traoré's closing ranks on our extractors. Gold's already down 12% from the Yatenga corridor. Uranium restrictions are next. If this spreads, he's a virus, another interjected. And if he inspires others, we're looking at a multi-billion-dollar bottleneck in 5 West African zones. Pam crossed her legs, glancing at the papers. So make him irrelevant. That's what you're for, the first man replied flatly. Another reached for the remote and turned on a screen in the corner. It showed a mock-up CNN headline, Burkinabe leader linked to terror network financing. Then another, Traoré's freedom agenda, risks U.S. national security experts. Say all fabricated, none published. Yet. Pam studied the screen. You want me to leak this to my contacts? Not yet, the man named Milo said. We roll this out in stages. First, whisper campaigns on podcasts, influencers. Get the audience to connect dots that don't exist. Then we fund concerned diaspora groups to call for sanctions. Meanwhile, your job is to keep his name hot but toxic? Understood, Pam replied. And the final act, Drake spoke now, voice deeper, slower. State Department pressure, visa revocation, maybe even a quiet indictment on something abstract, cybercrime, crypto misuse, anything that makes him look like a global risk. We don't need to kill him. Just make him untouchable. Pam nodded, leaning back. You're talking about full-spectrum character assassination. That's such a dramatic phrase, someone smirked. She didn't smile back. It's still the truth. There was a pause, a long one. And then Pam leaned forward, tapping the file with one manicured finger. I'll need one thing, she said. What immunity? If this leaks, if any of this is traced, it won't, Milo interrupted. Pam held his gaze. If you want me to be the voice of this circus, you'll keep my name off the back-end documents, the funding trails, the offshore accounts. Otherwise, I walk. There was another silence. Drake finally nodded. Done. Pam stood, sliding the file back across the table. Good, because no one is going to cry over a poor African soldier with delusions of grandeur. She walked to the door, pausing as her hand touched the handle. The sooner he's forgotten, the safer we all are. The door shut behind her. Inside, the men sipped bourbon, silent as kings preparing for war. But outside the hallway, just past the fire exit, a janitor's cart sat unattended. And beneath it, blinking softly in the dark, was a tiny recording device, still warm, still active. The elevator hummed quietly as it rose toward the 16th floor of the Stonebridge Continental Hotel. The doors opened with a soft chime. Traoré stepped out alone, his fedora now resting in his hand, his posture relaxed but alert. The suite at the end of the hallway had no number on the door, just a small brass plaque that read, Private. He paused for a beat, scanned the corridor instinctively, then entered with a coded keycard. Inside, the lights flickered on with a warm glow. The room was elegant but unassuming, not the kind that drew attention. Beige walls, oak desk, a leather chair facing a large window overlooking the Potomac. He walked to the curtains and closed them silently. Then he reached into the lining of his coat and withdrew a slim encrypted tablet Matte black fingerprint, locked untraceable. He placed it gently on the desk beside a dossier, marked only with a faded blue circle, his personal seal. A cup of tea untouched since morning sat on a tray near the window. He lifted it, took a small sip. Still lukewarm. On the desk were the items that had taken nearly a year to compile. Photocopies of internal memos, diagrams of mining sites across Burkina Faso, with export discrepancies highlighted in red. A spreadsheet showing humanitarian funds funneled into shell accounts funds that never reached the displaced families they were meant for. He flipped to the next section, photographs. A handshake between a U.S. official and a Burkina minister accused of corruption. Then another Pam Bondi posing with executives at an offshore energy summit in Lisbon. On the back of the photo, written in small, neat handwriting, 2 days before her first speech against me. Traoré didn't flinch. None of this was new to him. He opened the encrypted tablet. It lit up with 3 primary folders. Whistleblower transcripts, top payment networks, Tier 1, 3-year project, scythe, timeline, and contingency. He clicked the third. Inside, dozens of sub-files, recorded calls, investor logs, transportation manifests from Niger to French-controlled ports. Every node, every player. Not just American. European, too. Some even from within West Africa. The network was vast but not invisible. He leaned back, taking in the scale of what he had gathered. It wasn't just about the smear campaign. That was noise. The real crime was centuries older, the extraction of wealth without consequence, the erasure of voices behind policies crafted continents away. His eyes drifted to a small photograph taped inside the dossier's back cover. A dusty village road in Koudougou. Children chasing a rusted tire with sticks smiling. Behind them a billboard with peeling paint. The future is yours. He had walked that road once barefoot with a broken sandal and a head full of questions. Now he had answers. The television in the corner of the suite flickered on, silently, a news recap playing footage from Bondi's rally just hours earlier. The screen zoomed in on her as she named him, her voice laced with venom, conviction, and the confidence of someone who had never truly been challenged. He turned away. Traoré opened a new file on the tablet titled simply The Reveal. He hadn't expected to use it so soon, but the pieces were moving faster now. The game had shifted. He tapped out a message on a secure line. Stage 1 complete. Begin extraction of voice logs. Target capital source. Archive everything. His finger hovered over the send button for only a moment. Then without hesitation, he pressed it. Outside, the city pulsed with indifference. Sirens wailed blocks away. Neon signs blinked. Motorcades came and went. But inside that quiet suite, Ibrahim Traoré stood at the edge of something far greater than revenge. He was preparing an answer, a reckoning. And as he stared at the glowing city skyline through closed curtains, his voice broke the silence, low, steady, certain. They think Africa has no voice. They forget. We remember. Before the cameras, before the headlines, before he became a name whispered in war rooms and newsrooms alike, Ibrahim Traoré was just a barefoot boy in Kera, a small village nestled within the sun-cracked earth of western Burkina Faso. The dirt there was red rich in iron and memory. His earliest recollections were not of school books or soccer balls, but of the thick sound of pickaxes striking stone. Men from his village worked the nearby mines not with pride but with resignation. They'd rise before dawn, wrapped in silence, their eyes already drained of tomorrow. His father Mamadou was one of them, a man of few words and many scars. He never explained why food was often absent or why trucks bearing foreign flags left the mine full, while homes around it remained empty. But Ibrahim watched, and he remembered. At night, the boy would lie under mosquito nets patched with threadbare hope, staring up at a zinc roof that whined against the wind. His mother would hum a hymn, not from a hymn book, but from memory, and press her hand against his forehead as if willing him to dream of something better. You must grow stronger than this place, she would whisper, because they will never expect that from you. When his father fell ill from years inhaling mineral dust, no one came to help. Not the company that operated the mine, not the local officials who had once promised development, not the foreign aid workers who arrived with cameras and slogans, then vanished when the press did. Mamadou died quietly in a clay-walled room, his lungs heavy with something far more permanent than dust betrayal. At 16, Traoré left the village. He enrolled in a military preparatory academy in Ouagadougou, not because he loved war, but because it was one of the few paths where merit could outweigh money. He stood out early, not the fastest, not the loudest, but the most precise. While others shot to impress, he studied tactics late into the night. While some sought medals, he sought patterns in power and systems in silence. By 22, he had become a junior officer. By 26, he was deployed to oversee a rural security operation in the Tambao region, the site of one of Africa's richest manganese deposits. What he saw there cracked something inside him. Foreign companies, mostly European and Canadian, operated the mines. They arrived under banners of strategic partnership and human capital investment. Their PR campaigns featured smiling children with school books, new wells drilled by imported machines, and promises of jobs for the local economy. But Traoré saw the truth. He saw how the new schools were simply containers with donated textbooks used once for the photo op, then forgotten. He saw how the locals were hired for pennies a day, paid less than the fuel used to power the company's generators. He saw how thousands of tons of rare minerals left Burkina Faso each month, while nearby villages still had no running water, no power, and no clinics. One day during a routine patrol near the mine, he arrived at a village where the water had turned brown and acidic. The livestock had died. The children had sores on their skin. A local elder pulled him aside and whispered, "They came here with smiles, but took more than our minerals. They took our future and sold it back to us as a favor." That night, Traoré wrote in his personal log, "This is not development. This is conquest without bullets." His awakening wasn't sudden. It didn't come from one moment, but from hundreds, a collage of deceit framed as generosity. The more he rose in rank, the more invitations he received to leadership summits, sponsored by think tanks and consultants. Each gathering repeated the same script: economic cooperation, public-private partnerships, sustainable extraction. He learned to smile through the speeches, to nod politely, to ask quiet questions with sharp edges. But he never forgot his father's coughing, or his mother's hymns, or the way that elders' eyes glistened with a quiet, knowing rage. And by the time Traoré reached his early 30s, he no longer believed in salvaging the current system. He believed in dismantling it, brick by brick, deal by deal, lie by lie. To the world, Burkina Faso was a dot on the map, landlocked, poor, politically unstable. But to those who lived there in the dusty roads of Kaya, the gold-streaked hills of Gawa, and the fading colonial streets of Ouagadougou, it was not just a country, it was home, and it was slowly being strangled. Traoré didn't need an economist to explain what was happening. He had seen it with his own eyes. It wasn't occupation by soldiers, but contracts. It wasn't theft with guns, but with terms and conditions. Over the last 2 decades, agreements had been signed: trade deals, development packages, infrastructure loans, often by politicians in suits who smiled in front of cameras, but dined behind closed doors with men who didn't speak the local language. In exchange, Burkina Faso opened its veins: gold, manganese, uranium, bauxite, resources extracted in tons, promises delivered in kilobytes. It was colonialism in PowerPoint form. In a remote village near Diapaga, Traoré met a woman named Fatimata. She was 60, weathered like the bark of the shea tree she once harvested. Her farmland had been bought out not with money, but with a printed letter declaring the area strategically necessary for mineral development. The compensation, a one-time payment of $80 and a promise of training for alternative livelihoods. That was 5 years ago. Now Fatimata sat under a plastic tarp beside her daughter's 2 children, selling roasted peanuts. When Traoré asked what became of the promised training, she didn't answer. She just lifted her hand palm open and showed the cracks that ran through it, not from labor, but from washing clothes in chemically contaminated water. Further north in the Sahel region, he met Musa, a former cattle herder. His herds died off one by one after the nearby Chinese-backed gold mine redirected a tributary. When he protested, the local police accused him of inciting unrest. Musa was jailed for 3 months without trial. His land was gone by the time he was released. In Ouagadougou, Traoré listened to the story of Amadou, an elder who once taught history in the town school. He showed Traoré a copy of his last textbook, printed in France, funded by an NGO, with chapters praising Africa's integration into the global marketplace and avoiding any mention of colonial resistance movements. "Do you see?" Amadou said, voice brittle. "Even memory has been outsourced, And these weren't isolated cases. They were threads in a larger fabric, once stitched together by quiet foreign deals, local betrayal, and institutional gaslighting. When villagers protested unfair mining practices, they were labeled radicals. When journalists exposed environmental violations, their licenses were revoked. When youth groups demanded answers, they were promised vague reforms, then ignored. To many outsiders, Burkina Faso's leaders were seen attending global conferences, shaking hands with Western diplomats, signing letters of cooperation. But to the people back home, these same leaders were absent or worse, complicit. Traoré knew this system could not be changed with a speech. It could not be negotiated. It was designed to protect itself, to keep African nations just powerful enough to sign contracts but too weak to challenge the terms. That realization hardened something in him. He looked across the political landscape, not just of Burkina Faso, but of the entire region, and saw the same pattern repeating: pipelines that bypassed villages' aid, that circled back to donor banks' policies that sounded noble in French and English, but meant starvation in Fula and Moray. That night, as he sat under a flickering lamp in a rural outpost, pen scratching against a worn notebook, he wrote a sentence that would later become etched into speeches, classrooms, even graffiti on city walls. Freedom is not just independence, it is dignity. He underlined it twice, not because it was poetic, but because it was the only thing left they hadn't stolen. By the time Traoré returned from his regional military deployments, his eyes were no longer fixed outward. The flags on the foreign trucks were troubling, yes, but it was the hands that waved them through at the local checkpoints that unsettled him more. The enemy was not only across the ocean. It had been planted in the soil, watered by bribes, fed by silence, and protected by office. Burkina Faso had no shortage of patriots, but too many had been outnumbered by opportunists. Local governors who smiled in front of cameras and quietly negotiated site access fees. Ministers of energy who hosted cocktail fundraisers for foreign contractors, while schools in their own districts crumbled. Lawmakers who passed extractive agreements they couldn't even read or chose not to. What made it worse was the performance of it all. A national development plan updated every 5 years with new acronyms. A cabinet reshuffle every 2 years to demonstrate change. TV programs with ribbon cuttings and hard hats, speaking of growth corridors while mothers walked 15 kilometers for clean water. Traoré didn't point fingers at first. Not publicly. He simply spoke facts in town halls, at universities, and closed-door briefings. He began to propose reforms, transparency clauses in mining contracts, oversight committees independent of political parties, incentives for local processing industries rather than raw export. At first, people laughed. "You are a soldier," one minister chuckled, "not a technocrat." But the people, especially the young, the forgotten, the working, listened. And then they rallied. What started as murmurings in student unions became loud chants in public squares. The phrase "Traoré speaks the truth" began showing up on walls and online forums on the lips of villagers and shopkeepers. He never called himself a leader, but they started to. That was when the pushback began. Some of it was subtle. Invitations to strategic dialogues where smiling diplomats urged him to be realistic about global investment expectations. Some of it was threatening anonymous calls warning him to pick his battles or risk becoming another forgotten name. And some of it came wrapped in patriotism. Government officials accused him of sowing division, undermining the national interest. State media ran op-eds suggesting he had been influenced by extremist ideology. But Traoré had never held a foreign passport, never taken foreign funding, never stepped out of line with his military code. What terrified them wasn't what he'd done, it was what he could do. When Traoré was promoted to a strategic oversight command post near the capital, the establishment grew uneasy. It gave him not only credibility, but access to financial ledgers, infrastructure budgets, internal communications, and it gave him proximity to power. Bondi's camp first took notice when one of their affiliated contractors lost a bid for a mining renewal in Burkina Faso. The official reason, non-compliance with ethical procurement. The unofficial reason, Traoré. He hadn't signed the denial personally, but the regional committee that issued it included officers he had trained and mentored. The message was clear, the rules were changing. In an internal email later leaked to a whistleblower, a Bondi aide summarized it bluntly. "This man is not dangerous because he's radical. He's dangerous because he's disciplined. He doesn't shout, he just moves. We can't afford for his kind of leadership to become contagious." And so while Traoré continued building alliances with educators, soldiers, reformists, and elders, a counter-effort was already underway overseas in polished offices with soundproof doors and war rooms lined with maps not of borders, but of assets. Because to them, this wasn't just about Burkina Faso. It was about the idea of Africa speaking for itself and not asking permission. The building looked like any other mid-tier corporate headquarters, glass facade, minimalist interiors, a discreet plaque reading Global Stability Initiative. But those who entered knew better. This wasn't a policy hub. It was a weapon not of missiles or tanks, but of narratives. 2 floors underground, past biometric scans and privacy wards, sat a conference room that never appeared on the building's public floor plan. The walls were lined with acoustic panels, the lighting dim but clinical. Around the long oval table were 15 chairs. All were filled. Pam Bondi sat near the center, a tailored navy jacket over a graphite gray dress, her fingers drumming a precise rhythm against a legal pad. To her right was a senior consultant from Echelon Strategies, one of the Beltway's most powerful reputation engineering firms. Across from him, a tech executive from a Silicon Valley AI firm, lean mid-30s, nervously slicking his hair back as he prepared his slides. At the head of the table sat a former intelligence officer turned geopolitical analyst, a title that concealed more than it revealed. A map of Burkina Faso glowed on the large monitor. Red pins dotted mining regions. Blue pins marked recent protests. A white circle pulsed in the capital. Traoré, the analyst, began, has moved from nuisance to threat classification, not military, ideological. Bondi nodded. He's pulling moral high ground away from us using anti-colonial language. Youth appeal, clean uniform, no corruption scandal. Yet someone muttered. She continued. We can't assassinate character that hasn't been built up, so we give him a character the public is afraid of. The consultant leaned in. The key isn't to destroy him overnight. The key is to guide the suspicion. Let people arrive at conclusions we've already written. He clicked the remote. The next slide appeared, Phase 1, priming the narrative. Bullet points followed target think pieces in mid-tier publications, funded podcast appearances by regional experts, exaggerated stories of instability in West Africa. The tech executive added, we've created a series of auto-generated news sites. They scrape real headlines, then embed seeded stories in between. We also have synthetic voices trained on West African accents. They'll narrate these clips and push them into YouTube's recommendation engine via micro-targeting. He pulled up a sample on the screen. A video played scenes of protests, military trucks, overlaid with a concerned narrator. Tensions are rising under the strongman rule of Ibrahim Traoré, whose isolationist rhetoric has raised alarms across democratic nations. Bondi didn't blink. Another clip appeared, AI-generated images, not deep fakes, but convincingly ambiguous photos showing uniformed men exchanging cash envelopes. Unverified sources suggest financial dealings between Traoré's inner circle and illicit crypto networks tied to terror cells. The analyst turned down the volume. It's all deniable. Nothing we say directly, just things we make possible. The audience will do the rest. A lobbyist near the window finally spoke. Older white hair, thick accent from New England prep schools. And once the stink settles, the strategist smiled. Then we move to Phase 2 escalation. A known influencer, one of ours already in play, will reveal that Traoré receives speaking fees from shell NGOs. It'll be vague enough to avoid lawsuits, but clear enough to trend. Simultaneously, our partners in broadcast will run expert analysis, linking him to the Sahel arms market. Do we have military confirmation of that? The lobbyist asked. We don't need it. We have plausible patterns. That's the currency now. Bondi leaned back, eyes narrowed. You're not worried this blows back, that we get caught? The analyst shook his head. We've created a fog. Not a lie, just so many competing truths that no one knows what to believe. In that fog, our story becomes the clearest shape. Silence followed. Then a final slide. Phase 3. Policy action. Visa restrictions, asset freezes, coordinated media blackout. If needed, State Department can cite public unrest as grounds for sanctions. Bondi scribbled something on her pad, then looked up. Make sure nothing ties back to the U.S. government. Keep this grassroots. Civil society complaints, diaspora groups, open letters. Make it look like the world is waking up to him. She stood collecting her notes. And let's get the phrase militarized populism trending by the end of the week. As the room emptied, only the strategist and the tech executive remained. The younger man looked uneasy. You ever feel like, this isn't what we were trained for? The strategist gave him a faint smile. This is exactly what we were trained for. Just no one told you the battles would look like this. Outside DC glistened in the dusk, but deep within its veins the war for perception had begun silent, synthetic, and strategic. It started with a whisper, then a headline. At first it was a segment buried in the middle of the morning anchor line, broadcast on Global Point News, a mid-tier outlet with just enough credibility and just enough reach. The anchor, with a furrowed brow and performative neutrality, introduced the piece with practiced concern. Burkina Faso's military leader, Ibrahim Traoré, faces fresh scrutiny today as intelligence sources raise questions about the origin of funding tied to his administration's political rise. No facts, no names, just questions. The following day, Continental View, another network with polished presenters and discreet benefactors, ran a full 8-minute report. It was slick, fast-paced cut with clips of masked men in the Sahel, statistics about illicit arms trafficking, and maps linking unrelated regions through a web of red lines. The title bar beneath the footage read, "Is this Africa's new tyrant in the making?" A day later, the Beacon Ledger, a respected paper of record, published an editorial from a so-called regional policy expert. Traoré speaks the language of justice, but history teaches us that populist militarism often leads to destabilization. America should tread carefully. We've seen this before. The byline was familiar to those who tracked lobbying disclosures. Soon the cycle had begun. Cable panelists started tossing Traoré's name around between takes on rising fuel prices and immigration reform. Twitter bots pushed hashtags like Wash Traoré threat and Africa instability. Anonymous blogs published investigative threads outlining supposed connections between Traoré's inner circle and cryptocurrency wallets tied to dark web exchanges. Within a week, a cover story from the influential but fictional World Eye Weekly declared in bold, sensational letters, "The African strongman America should fear." The article, long and dramatically written, cited unnamed sources and a leaked intelligence report that didn't exist. Its claims were vague, emotionally charged, and perfectly engineered to evade legal liability while planting doubt. Back in Ouagadougou, Traoré's staff monitored the media flood with grim expressions. They recognized the pattern, the pacing, the repetition. It wasn't journalism, it was programming. The real battlefield wasn't facts, it was perception. Meanwhile, in Atlanta, Paris, Toronto, and Dakar, members of the Burkinabe diaspora tried to fight back. College students launched video campaigns on Instagram, countering the claims with timelines, receipts, voice notes. Community leaders penned op-eds defending Traoré's record on anti-corruption and local investment. Activists hosted live streams comparing him to other African leaders who had been discredited just before instituting reforms. But their content was flagged, shadow banned, demonetized. A video titled "Debunking the Traoré Terror Myth" was pulled from a major platform within 12 hours of posting, cited as potentially misleading. A podcast episode titled "Africa's Rising Leaders," without Western approval, was inexplicably dropped from its distribution service. At a community center in the Bronx, an elderly Burkinabe man named Bako watched one of the reports on a muted TV. The footage was grainy, showing a clip of Traoré addressing a crowd. Only the clip had been cropped, stripped of context, his words subtitled in English with ominous phrasing he never actually used. Bako turned to his grandson and said, "When they fear your truth, they will sell your image." Even mainstream African-American commentators who cautiously voiced support for Traoré began receiving pressure from sponsors and publishers. A talk show host received a gentle warning from a network executive after airing a clip of Traoré speaking about mineral rights. "Let's avoid aligning with instability narratives, okay?" The silence was growing louder, and across every time zone Traoré watched. He wasn't surprised. He had prepared for it. But even he felt the weight of how quickly perception could be altered, how stories could be sculpted by those who never set foot on his soil, never saw the villages, never tasted the water, never buried a friend who died in a tunnel built for someone else's profit. He didn't need to call it war. It was already that. Just one wage with algorithms and airtime. The message arrived encoded not by phone, not by email, but through a secure drop embedded within a digital mesh only a handful of people in the world knew how to access. It was short, no salutation, just a phrase. If you're not afraid of the dark, meet me in Geneva. Wednesday, room 612, trust no intermediaries. Traoré read it twice, then again. He didn't recognize the sender. But the encryption signature, the style, the obfuscation layers was unmistakable. Military grade, Western built. 3 days later, at a discreet boutique hotel tucked away on a quiet Geneva side street, he stepped into the elevator alone and pressed the button to the 6th floor. The hallway was dim, the carpet muted in color, the doors spaced far apart. Room 612 sat at the far end, its peephole covered with a black sticker. He knocked once, then twice. The door opened. The man who greeted him was older than expected, early 60s maybe, with gray-streaked stubble, and eyes that flicked to every corner of the hallway before he ushered Traoré inside. He walked with the cautious rhythm of someone who had once trusted the wrong people. The room was nondescript. Curtains-drawn television unplugged, a laptop sitting on the desk with a hardline cable running out of a private VPN router. 2 cups of coffee steamed on a tray. No sugar, no cream. The man sat first. "You don't know me. You shouldn't. But I know you." Traoré remained standing silent. "My name isn't important," the man said. "But I used to brief people like Pam Bondi. Used to design the kind of campaigns you're now on the receiving end of." A pause. "I left the agency 3 years ago. Thought I was out. Thought I could live with what I'd done. But this," he pointed to a stack of USB drives on the table. "This crossed a line I didn't even think they recognized anymore." Traoré sat his voice low. "What's on them? Internal memos, disinformation briefings, simulated media paths, synthetic audio scripts. It's not just a smear job. It's a psychological warfare program." The man took a breath. "They've named it Project Glint. It's being run through a private cutout with State Department blessing." He slid one drive forward. "On this one, there's a conversation between a senior advisor to Bondi and a European investor group. They're discussing how to engineer civil disruption near your mines to justify security interventions." Traoré looked at it, then back at the man. "Why give this to me?" The man stared at the floor, then said quietly, "Because I've seen this script before. Different names, different countries, same ending. Leaders discredited, people divided, resources signed away under the banner of stability. But you," he met Traoré's eyes, "you're not playing your part. And they don't know what to do with that." The room sat still for a moment, the hum of the VPN router the only sound. Traoré reached out, collected the drive. "Have you spoken to anyone else?" "No, I won't. After this, I disappear." He rose to leave, then paused at the door. "You'll need this when the storm hits, not to defend yourself, but to light the whole damn sky." Traoré didn't respond. He simply nodded once. Back in his suite that night, he uploaded the files onto an isolated device, scanning every line, every audio clip, every signature. They were authentic, disturbingly thorough. The enemy had not underestimated him. They had feared him enough to build an entire machine. He stood at the window, watching the city lights of Geneva ripple in the reflection of the lake. Then, almost to himself, he said with calm and finality, "I will not play defense. It's time to show the world what they hide." In a rented apartment tucked above a quiet bakery in Brussels, a small war room had come to life. There were no weapons, no flags, just the soft hum of laptops, the clatter of keystrokes, and the sharp scent of espresso brewed by a jittery intern who hadn't slept in 36 hours. This was the nucleus Traoré's inner circle of digital warriors. 3 data analysts, 2 investigative journalists, a former international law scholar, and 1 encryption specialist who preferred to go only by Mori. They were young, smart, and burning with the kind of focused fury born not from ideology but lived experience. Across the walls, digital maps pulsed with cross-border transaction routes. One projection showed shell companies scattered like breadcrumbs across the British Virgin Islands, Dubai, and Luxembourg. Another screen cycled through media clips highlighting identical phrasing across dozens of independent news outlets. In the center of the room was a whiteboard labeled Truth Files, Core Clusters, Financial Trail Mineral Royalties, Dasher, counteratack, off-books transfers, policy leverage lobbying, sanction engineering, media coordination, asset control, narrative amplification. Traoré stood near the window, arms crossed. He wasn't directing. He was watching, absorbing every bite of treachery revealed in real time. Maury pointed at the screen. We've confirmed 12 overlapping assets linked to one consulting firm, Westridge Solutions. They've quietly advised 5 administrations across West Africa while simultaneously managing investment portfolios for resource conglomerates based in the US, Canada, and the UK. He clicked again. A flow chart expanded. Funds, political donations, legal reforms, extraction contracts, laundered dividends. The journalist from Ghana Akosua jumped in. We've got the email chains. They bragged about fast-tracking a deal in Niger by exploiting conflict zones. They used words like manageable unrest and narrative cushioning. Another click. A PowerPoint deck popped up. Real slides from a lobbying presentation delivered to Western investors just 4 months ago. Current leadership in Burkina Faso poses challenges to long-term mineral extraction stability. Strategic information management recommended. It was corporate speak for take him down. Each revelation hardened the team's resolve. But with each file added to the truth archive, the air in the apartment grew heavier. The stakes were no longer theoretical. 2 nights prior, a letter had arrived, slid beneath the door of Traoré's hotel room in Geneva. No return address. Just a folded page inside typed no signature. This is not your fight. Step back while you still have something left to lose. No demands, no threats, just the chilling courtesy of a warning. That same day, one of the legal researchers had their apartment door jimmied open. Nothing was stolen, just a clear signal. We see you. But none of it stopped the work. If anything, it accelerated it. The legal scholar Nadine began drafting a public-facing brief, a simplified but devastating narrative summary. It wasn't enough to dump files. They needed coherence, a story people could follow, one that exposed not only the financial machinery, but the complicity of media politicians and private actors working across jurisdictions. Forget sensationalism, Traoré said. We win with clarity. He was right. The world didn't need another scandal. It needed a pattern, one impossible to ignore. Outside, the bakery closed for the evening, its shutters rolling down with a metallic snap. Inside, the glow of the laptops lit tired faces, but no one moved to rest. There was still work to do. Maury clicked a final tab. We traced metadata from the smear campaign videos. Guess what? The servers routing the uploads are sitting in Northern Virginia, right next to a known intelligence contractor. Traoré didn't react. Instead, he looked to the map, then to the photos of displaced farmers pinned beside it. Then, with the calm precision of a general studying terrain, he said, "Good. When we show the world what they've done, they won't just see theft. They'll see design." He tapped the whiteboard lightly. This isn't revenge, it's revelation. And for the first time since the war of perception had begun, they weren't chasing lies. They were building the truth. It was a gray morning in Washington, D.C., the kind of filtered light that made the city look like it had something to hide. Outside the National Press Club, reporters huddled near the entrance, checking badges and whispering to one another. The invitation had been cryptic, distributed just 24 hours earlier. Urgent briefing on geopolitical disinformation and resource exploitation, presented by Captain Ibrahim Traoré, Burkina Faso Armed Forces, strictly on record. Doors lock at 9:00 a.m. The room wasn't large, but it was full. Journalists from independent outlets, curious think tank fellows, a few skeptics from mainstream cable networks, and several embassy staffers trying to look like interns. 2 cameras were already rolling quietly in the back. At exactly 9:00 a.m., the door shut with a firm click, and at 9:01, Traoré walked in. No entourage, no podium theatrics, just a well-pressed uniform, a tablet in his hand, and the quiet stillness of a man who already knew what he was about to say would land like a meteor. He took a seat at the long table and began without preamble. This will not be a long speech. I am not here to impress you with language or appeal to your sentiment. I am here to present facts that affect my country and implicate some of yours. He placed the tablet on the table and tapped it once. The large screen behind him lit up with a map of West Africa. Dots spread across Burkina Faso, connected by red lines that led not just to ports and airports, but to banks in Switzerland, lobby firms in New York, and a media shell corporation based in Delaware. He clicked again. These are the cross-border financial flows extracted from Burkina Faso's natural resources over the past 5 years. You will notice a mismatch between what was reported and what was actually moved. He let the slide sit. Then another tap. A short audio clip played. Voice. Will use media saturation to destabilize the man before Q3. Push the regional threat angle. Let the State Department pick up the noise later. A few gasps. Heads turned. Some instinctively glanced toward the exit. Traoré continued unfazed. This voice belongs to the chief advisor to Pamela Bondi, recorded during a meeting with representatives of a Canadian mining consortium. Another click. A document appeared, real letterhead, visible email chain, subject line. Subject RE containing. Traoré neutralize Traoré before Q3. Prioritize optics. We'll manage the narrative from this side. Silence dropped into the room like a stone. He turned to the audience. They use the word neutralize because it sounds cleaner than silence. And they speak of optics because the truth to them is not a matter of justice, but of management. For the next 20 minutes, he went point by point, displaying maps of illegal mining routes masked as development zones, tax havens used to funnel profits through shell companies, and transcripts of strategy sessions hosted by private PR firms hired to smear his leadership. There was no bombast, no anger, just clarity and an overwhelming weight of evidence. When he was finished, he said, "This is not only about Burkina Faso. This is about how truth is shaped and how silence is bought. We will not ask for pity. We will not ask for rescue. We only ask that you stop pretending not to see." He stood. "The rest of the documents will be made public within the hour. I suggest you clear your schedules." And with that, he walked out, no questions, no security, no backward glance. Outside, the clouds had begun to break, but inside the press room, the atmosphere remained suspended. Laptops clicked furiously. Phones lit up. Emails raced across continents. Pam Bondi's name had just entered a new kind of spotlight, one she could not control. And far away in rooms where narratives were normally sculpted, a quiet panic began to ripple. Because the truth was no longer whispered. It had just gone live. The press conference ended at 9:47 a.m. By 10:03, the video was already trending on 3 continents. By 10:14, the Beacon Ledger posted an urgent editorial note. "We are reviewing recently surfaced materials that may impact earlier reporting." By 10:26, Pam Bondi appeared on live television. Flanked by 2 advisors and standing at a podium emblazoned with the American flag, she looked collected but unmistakably rattled. This is a targeted campaign by a foreign actor who wants to undermine American institutions. I have never and would never engage in any plan to neutralize anyone. These documents are clearly manipulated. My team is investigating their origin and authenticity. She didn't take questions. The statement aired on Continental View, which immediately launched a fact-check segment seeded with talking points from Bondi's office. The anchors repeated words like alleged foreign interference and digital forgery. But outside of that echo chamber, the floodgates had opened. On Twitter, the hashtags detonated. Traoré leaks. Africa speaks. Shuri expose. The deal. Shari resource colonialism. Within hours, memes erupted, one of Traoré calmly sipping tea as documents exploded behind him. Another with side-by-side clips of Bondi calling for his removal, then denying she knew about it at all. A political cartoon showed a puppet master severing its own strings in panic. And then came the silence. Several outlets that had run hit pieces on Traoré days before suddenly went quiet. No retractions, no corrections. Just a curious absence, segments, pulled articles, quietly archived social media posts deleted. Their silence was louder than their words. But others erupted. Independent journalists dug into the leaked files with glee. Within hours, verified financial paths were circulating corporate shell structures. Paid media consultants and lobbying firms caught red-handed, managing 2 faces, one for the press, another for investors. One investigative reporter from Nairobi tweeted, "This isn't just about Burkina Faso. This is a template. Nigeria, Congo, Mozambique, we've all seen this." Traoré didn't just expose them, he exposed the system. International reaction varied. The European Commission issued a cautiously worded statement. We are reviewing recent revelations and remain committed to transparency and development partnerships. Behind closed doors, diplomats scrambled to assess just how far the files reached. Inside Capitol Hill, staffers whispered in elevators. A few sympathetic lawmakers, mostly younger progressive voices, began calling for an inquiry. Meanwhile, senior figures bristled. The issue wasn't whether the documents were real. The issue was that they'd been believed. Public sentiment had shifted fast and the machine hadn't adjusted quickly enough. Bondi's team attempted to pivot, framing Traoré as manipulative, media-savvy, a political opportunist. But the narrative no longer belonged to them. On TikTok, young African Americans posted side-by-side reactions to Traoré's speech. A schoolteacher in Baltimore filmed her class watching the conference with the caption, "My students just saw what integrity looks like. They're asking more questions than ever." In Accra, a street artist painted a mural of Traoré on a concrete wall, half soldier, half teacher, with the words beneath, "Not against the West," just not beneath it. By the end of the day, the truth files had been downloaded over 12 million times. Bondi's staff went into lockdown. Phones off, curtains drawn, press liaisons unavailable for comment. But the damage was done, not because Traoré shouted louder, but because when he finally spoke, people listened. For 48 hours, it felt like the tide had turned. The truth files had spread globally. Bondi was on the defensive. Public opinion was shifting fast. Traoré's message echoed from classrooms to parliaments. But power, especially the kind built behind closed doors, never falls silently. It strikes back. The first counterblow wasn't visible. It came in code lines of it. At 2:14 a.m., the secure nucleus server in Brussels went dark. Not down dark. A cyber attack had slipped past the firewalls using zero-day vulnerabilities and a mimic IP from a diplomatic server in Eastern Europe. Within minutes, encrypted drives began to self-corrupt. Backup nodes were hit. 2 of the team's cloud redundancies were locked with a single mocking message. Truth is relative, so is access. Verb. Reverb was an alias tied to past information blackouts in South America and the Balkans. No one had ever claimed responsibility, but insiders suspected a private intelligence unit contracted through multiple Western clients. Its digital fingerprints were always neat, always deniable. The nucleus team scrambled. Mori stayed up for 36 hours recovering fragments. They saved most of the archive, but not all. Some original metadata timestamps, raw location files were gone for good. Then came the second strike. 2 days later, Akosua Mensah, the Ghanaian journalist who had co-authored a key expose within the truth files, was killed in what local authorities called a traffic accident. A delivery truck had allegedly swerved to avoid a pothole and slammed into her compact car. Witnesses contradicted each other. Security footage from the intersection was mysteriously corrupted. Her laptop and notes, which she always kept in her bag, were missing. When the news reached Brussels, the room went silent. Mori punched the wall. Nadine wept openly. Traoré didn't speak for a long time. When he did, his voice was barely audible. They want fear to silence what truth cannot. But even grief had little time to settle before the third strike arrived. At 6:03 p.m. that same day, Continental View aired a breaking investigative segment showing a blurred clip of a man in military uniform, edited to look like Traoré, exchanging what appeared to be money with armed men in a desert camp. The headline read, "Traoré African Revolutionary or Warlord in Disguise." The footage was doctored, grainy spliced, but slickly packaged. The anchor's voice was laced with concern. If true, this could point to a troubling alliance between Traoré and armed separatists in the Sahel. Is this the man global youth are rallying behind? Within hours, talking heads across networks echoed the same lines. Pre-written op-eds resurfaced. Even Bondi, who had gone silent since the leak, reappeared on a Sunday morning show. "Look, I've said from the beginning I want stability for Africa. But if Mr. Traoré is working with armed groups, that's not courage. That's chaos." No one mentioned the truth files. No one mentioned Akosua. The script had flipped. On social media, a new wave of bot accounts began flooding the hashtags that had supported Traoré, now spamming them with violence-adjacent content and misquotes. On forums, trolls accused him of staging the entire leak for political gain. A new label emerged, the polished extremist. It was catchy, dangerous. At an emergency meeting in Brussels, the team debated going public again to rebut the clip, denounce the cyber attack, and call out Okosua's death. But Traoré raised a hand. Not yet. If we react to every lie, we follow their rhythm. We can mourn, but we must not scatter. He stood gaze fixed on the screen, displaying Okosua's last story, her headline still glowing, The Looted Vein, How West Africa's Wealth Funds Western Politics. She told the truth, he said quietly. They killed her for it, so we owe her one thing above all, to finish what she started. Outside, the world debated his integrity. Inside, Traoré planned his next move, not in panic, not in rage, but with the chilling precision of someone who had always known this moment would come. The machine had fired back, but this time the world was watching. The message came through secure text, but the words felt like they'd been carved in stone fire. École Sainte-Marie, arson suspected. Everyone escaped. Buildings gone. Mariam is safe, but shaken. Traoré read it twice, unmoving. École Sainte-Marie was his sister's life's work. A small sunlit school in the outskirts of Koudougou, built not with grants or government funds, but brick by handmade brick. Mariam had raised it from the soil with her own hands, starting with a single classroom, then another, until laughter and chalk dust filled the halls. And now it was ash. He stared at the screen in silence, fingers still. Around him, the war room moved on, journalists coordinating, Maury muttering to himself about new encryption protocols, Nadine drafting their next legal move, but Traoré had receded into stillness. No anger. Not yet. Only stillness. That night, long after the others had gone quiet, Traoré sat alone by the window, the moonlight pouring like water onto the wooden floor. The cold from the glass crept into his skin, but he didn't move. The city outside pulsed with the indifference of civilization. Horns, lights, a siren far off. Life continuing as if the world hadn't just cracked open. His mind drifted to another fire. One from decades earlier. He was 10. Their mother had fallen ill with a fever no clinic in their village could treat. The nearest hospital was over 50 kilometers away, and the only vehicle was the company truck, and they didn't lend it to villagers. Not for free. He had watched helplessly as the fever took her hour by hour until her breathing slowed, then stopped. That night, as they wrapped her in cotton cloth and dug a place in the dry earth, Mariam had whispered, "We will build something, Ibrahim, something that no one can take." He had nodded, but inside a vow was forming, one his sister never heard. They will take everything, unless we give them nothing left to take. Now staring out at a foreign skyline, far from that dusty promise, Traoré felt the old fear rising, not for his own life, but for how his name was being used to hurt those he loved. This was no longer just disinformation, no longer digital. It had become physical, personal. They hadn't attacked him directly. That would be too obvious, too noisy. Instead, they had reached back through shadow intermediaries, hired hands, deniable men with gasoline, and burned what mattered most. He imagined Mariam sifting through the ashes, still standing, still stubborn, still refusing to give them the satisfaction of tears. But he also knew the tremble she'd hide in her hands, the grief she'd bury to stay strong. His phone buzzed again. "She wants you to know she's not afraid." She said, "We've lost chalk and walls, not our purpose." A long breath left his lungs slow and silent. It would be easy to give in now, to step back, to rationalize retreat, to call it strategic pause, and disappear behind diplomacy. That was what they wanted, not his destruction, but his withdrawal, his silence. But he had made a promise, and now it had fire beneath it. He stood, straightened his coat, and walked to the desk where the remaining press materials were being finalized. The statement, the footage, the next wave of evidence. If they wanted to burn everything to keep him quiet, they were about to learn something. He had already buried too much to ever go silent again. The official headlines grew quieter, but the streets did not. In cities across West Africa, from Dakar to Cotonou, Ouagadougou to Lagos, the posters went up overnight. Paper thin, printed on old inkjets, taped to walls and lampposts, Traoré told the truth. Some bore his face, others showed maps from the truth files, hand-drawn, circled with red markers, and notes in local dialects. And under each, we are awake now. In Accra, a group of university students organized a solidarity march without permits. Over 3,000 people showed up. They wore shirts with slogans like "Dignity is not dangerous" and "You cannot smear the sun." They marched in silence, arms linked, holding up pages from the leaked documents as if they were relics. No party flags, no chants, just presence. In Nairobi, a cafe owner wrote Traoré's name in chalk on his outdoor board, under the daily quote of the day: "When they lie about you, they fear you. When they burn your school, they fear what you've taught." Even in Johannesburg, thousands gathered outside the French consulate demanding the expulsion of foreign firms profiting from African resources. This wasn't about Burkina Faso anymore. It was about memory, about injustice long buried under paperwork and platitudes. And it didn't stop at Africa's shores. In a modest church hall in Jackson, Mississippi, a group of African-American elders, descendants of enslaved people, held a special prayer circle. They didn't know Traoré personally, but they recognized something in him. After the final hymn, they passed around a letter written in elegant cursive by a retired teacher named Ruth Eloise Jackson. It read, "Dear Captain Traoré, we've seen men like you in our dreams. Honest, firm, patient. They called our truth dangerous once too. They feared our vote, our voice, our books. But we're still here. And now so are you. Don't stop." The letter was posted online. It was shared by a high school student in Chicago, then a rapper in Atlanta, then a member of Congress. Soon messages began pouring in, not from institutions, but from people. A U.S. veteran in Arizona posted a video standing in front of his garage with an American flag folded behind him. In it, he said, "I didn't serve to protect lies. What Traoré showed us, that's what bravery looks like. The kind we forgot how to recognize." He paused, holding up a printout of one of the Truth Files maps. "This ain't a foreign story. This is the same playbook used right here, just different targets." Within days, an informal coalition of African and African-American artists, scholars, and civic leaders launched a digital archive, Rasher Echo of Truth, a central hub for leaked documents, translated summaries, visual explainers, and personal testimonies. Everywhere, ordinary people became curators of clarity, and slowly those who had stayed silent began to shift. Journalists who had ignored the leaks started referencing them in interviews. Podcasters who had hesitated to weigh in now invited experts to unpack what had been exposed. Church groups held panel discussions. Youth groups held screenings of Traoré's press conference in school gymnasiums. This was no longer about Traoré. Not entirely. It was about the undeniable truth he had pulled into the light and the cost he had paid to do it. In an era where reality had become slippery, manipulated, and commodified, one man had dared to present a version so raw, so thoroughly evidenced, that people across continents recognized it as their own reflection. This was no longer about politics. It was about truth. And truth, once it finds a voice, becomes an anthem. The hearing room in Capitol Hill wasn't designed for truth. It was designed for performance. Dark wood, deep green carpeting, gold-trimmed flags. Cameras perched on ledges like crows ready to feed the spectacle to millions. But on this day, something different was in the air. Not just scrutiny, pressure. The Committee on International Oversight and Ethics had convened an emergency hearing. The headlines leading up to it left no ambiguity. Traoré's leaks shake Capitol calls for investigation reach critical mass. Did U.S. officials interfere in African sovereignty? Pam Bondi sat at the long table in the witness chair flanked by legal counsel. She wore neutral gray, no flag pin, no statement jewelry. She didn't smile. Cameras clicked as the chairwoman called the hearing to order. It began with procedural formality roll calls, motions, disclaimers. But the room vibrated beneath the civility, because what had once been dismissed as conspiracy now had documents, audio names, dates. Bondi's opening remarks were short and calculated. "Let me be clear. I have never authorized, directed, or participated in any campaign to destabilize a foreign government. The materials released are misleading, at best fabricated at worst. I reject any suggestion that I was involved in what some are now calling information warfare." She paused, rehearsed. "My record speaks for itself." The committee began questioning. Some members were cautious, careful not to appear partisan. Others were brutal. Representative Alvarez from Arizona leaned forward, tapping a folder with bold black letters, "Extracts Project Glint Miss." Bondi, this memo includes a quote from your senior advisor stating, "Neutralize Traoré before Q3. Are you saying you were unaware of that language being used?" She blinked. "I had no knowledge of that phrasing or the context in which it was written. So your staff acted independently using psychological manipulation tactics against a foreign leader? I don't accept that characterization. The documents do." Her lawyer whispered something in her ear. She nodded faintly. Her voice was smaller on the next reply. "If my staff acted improperly, I was not informed." Some members scoffed, others took notes. Then the chairwoman nodded to the next scheduled speaker. A hush fell over the chamber as a young girl entered, accompanied by a translator and a community advocate. She was small, no more than 9 years old, with neatly braided hair in a deep blue dress. Her name was Jamila Traoré, Ibrahim's niece. Her voice barely reached the microphones. "My school burned," she said softly. "But before it did, I drew pictures of what I wanted to be. A teacher, like my aunt. But now, we have no school." The translator paused, looking briefly shaken. "My uncle tries to help us, not just our village. All of Burkina Faso. He gives people their voice. But now people say he is dangerous. They say lies on the TV. They try to make him disappear with words." Cameras stopped clicking. The room was silent. "I don't understand politics, but I know when someone is trying to steal something from someone who already has very little." She stepped down without ceremony. No applause, just silence. Later that evening, news outlets across the spectrum ran the footage. Some anchors spun the moment as emotional manipulation. Others praised her as the bravest voice on the Hill. But the moment stuck. It cut through the fog of policy language, partisan talking points, and national defense justifications. It landed not as argument, but truth. And for the first time in a long time, Congress felt what it had not felt in years: shame. Because a child had shown up not to indict them with evidence, but with innocence. The dominoes didn't fall loudly. They fell strategically. First was Mali announcing through its state-owned news channel that all bilateral mineral contracts involving rare earth extraction with U.S. firms were under sovereign review. Within a week, Guinea followed, freezing 2 high-profile aluminum deals pending a regional audit. Then Senegal, in a move that stunned Western investors, declared an immediate suspension of 3 oil exploration contracts brokered in D.C. just 2 years prior. The message was not subtle. Africa was no longer on autopilot. In Geneva, the United Nations Human Rights Council opened a special session on international resource sovereignty and transparency. While historically symbolic this time, the mood was different. Delegates from the Global South, long relegated to footnotes in global resource policy, spoke with the weight of public will behind them. A special subcommittee was formed to investigate undue influence in resource governance and neocolonial economic practices. Burkina Faso submitted the truth files as evidence. The term Traoré Doctrine began appearing in think tank papers, a framework of moral economic independence, youth-led accountability, and civic data transparency. Even in capitals where he was still considered a disruptive figure, his influence was now being studied cautiously but seriously. Meanwhile, on the streets of Harlem, far from conference halls and auditoriums, a different kind of history was unfolding. At the Langston Cultural Center, a modest brick building tucked between boutiques and bodegas, a crowd of young African-American organizers, educators, and artists gathered to meet Ibrahim Traoré in person. It had taken months to plan. Invitations had gone out in secret. The press had been kept away. Inside, the room smelled of shea butter incense and nervous hope. They expected a speech. What they got was a conversation. Traoré, dressed in a simple charcoal blazer, no entourage, stood among them like a visiting Uncle Warm, listening, laughing, low eyes, always attentive. There was no podium, just folding chairs in a circle and an old jazz record playing faintly in the background. "I am not here to lead you," he said after a moment. "You are already leaders. I am only a branch like you of something older, stronger." He looked around the room. "We are branches of the same tree." A young woman named Celeste, a public school teacher from Brooklyn, stood up. "We feel your struggle, but we also feel forgotten. The news talks about you, but they don't talk about the systems we live under here. Racism, exploitation, surveillance. It's not just an African story, it's a global one. Traoré nodded, slowly. That's why they work so hard to keep us from seeing each other. He gestured to a drawing on the wall, one of Langston Hughes with his pen raised like a sword. They know if we connect, we will not need their definitions anymore. Not of democracy, not of freedom, not of dignity. The room went still. Then from the back someone clapped. Not polite applause, but solidarity. Soon others joined in. It wasn't about celebration, it was about recognition. In that moment, Harlem didn't feel like an island. It felt like part of a coastline stretching back to Ouagadougou, Lagos, Port-au-Prince, Jackson, Mississippi places, where truth was no longer waiting for permission to speak. The truth files had begun as documents. Now they were becoming dialogue. There were no cameras waiting on the tarmac, no brass bands, no velvet ropes or pre-written speeches, only the wind, only the dust, and the children. When Ibrahim Traoré stepped off the military plane, his boots hit the ground of Burkina Faso with the same silent resolve that had carried him through DC Harlem and the firestorms in between. The runway wasn't even paved, just hardened earth surrounded by dry fields and acacia trees. But there they were, rows and rows of children gathered from nearby villages, lining the road with palms raised in uncoordinated salute. Some waved paper flags, some simply smiled. Most didn't understand the politics, the dashis, or the leaks, but they knew one thing: their schools had been rebuilt. Their parents had stopped whispering, and the man who'd left quietly had now returned the same way, with no medals, but with meaning. Back in Washington, the headlines had been different. Bondi steps down amid mounting scrutiny. Lobby ties under investigation following whistleblower hearing. Pam Bondi had resigned quietly, citing health and personal reasons. But the internal memos and emails leaked steadily through a newly launched independent investigative coalition had painted a darker picture. Not criminal, perhaps, but callous, cold, calculated. She wasn't the only one retreating. Several corporations named in the truth files issued statements of non-involvement, even as class action lawsuits were filed by civil society groups across 5 countries. Depositions were scheduled. Subpoenas were served. No one expected swift justice, but the invincibility had cracked. They bled and the world smelled it. The international community shifted too. UN commissions on ethical development were no longer ceremonial. Policy drafts referenced the Burkina model, a blend of data transparency, community oversight, and youth participation in contract negotiations. What had begun as a man defending his name had evolved into a country reclaiming its narrative. But Traoré didn't speak of it. Not that day. He visited his sister first. The foundation of the burned school had been cleared. A new building was already underway thanks to local volunteers and diaspora donations. They didn't embrace immediately. They simply stood together, watching the children draw chalk letters on plywood boards. Later he walked alone, up a ridge near his childhood village where the red earth gave way to a view that stretched for miles: dusty plains, scattered huts, distant drums. The sun was beginning to set, casting the land in a golden hush. The breeze rustled through tall grass and millet fields below. He stood there for a long time. No guards, no advisors, no sound but the earth breathing. His country was still poor, still recovering, but it was awake, and so was the world. He looked down at the land not as something to rule, but something he belonged to. This victory had not come with parades or parliaments. It came with scars, with whispers, with standing his ground when even silence tried to push him back. He did not smile, but his eyes softened. Behind him, faintly, the laughter of children drifted upward like birdsong, a reminder of what endured. No anthem played, but something had changed. A quiet victory, one that didn't need to be declared, only witnessed. The first arrived from a retired Marine in Kansas. I was trained to follow orders, but your courage taught me to question silence. Thank you, Captain. Then came one from a history teacher in Ohio. I played your speech for my students. One of them cried. Another asked how to help. Farmers from Mississippi, veterans from Vermont, nurses from Detroit, preachers from Georgia, emails, postcards, letters scrawled by hand, thousands of them. Each one shared a confession, a reckoning, and a thank you. I didn't know, but now I care. Thank you for waking us up. Clips began to spread online. In Oakland, youth councils organized to audit their city contracts. In Birmingham, a retired union leader led weekly teach-ins on global exploitation. In Senegal, a group of teenagers started a grassroots journalism blog called Echo Eyes. The movement had no leader, now it had momentum. It wasn't grand. Just a single live stream from Ouagadougou broadcast to community centers and mobile phones across the world. Ibrahim Traoré stood behind a wooden podium with no logo. No applause before, no music. His voice was low, steady. We are not enemies, but we must stop pretending silence is neutral. He spoke not of revenge, but of responsibility, of choices, of voices that history tries to erase, and those brave enough to remember. If you benefit from a broken system and do nothing, you are not innocent, but you can still choose to become aware, and then to act. In Harlem, a grandmother clutched her chest and whispered, "Yes." In Paris, a student turned off the news and just cried. In a Senate chamber in Washington, an aide paused, shook his head and whispered to no one, "He's right." When the broadcast ended, there was no call to arms, just quiet, reflection, a trembling kind of applause that started in small rooms and spread like sunrise. In a modest classroom in rural Louisiana, a teacher pressed play. The projector flickered to life, showing a short film about a soldier from Africa who fought not with weapons but with truth. The children watched in silence, wide-eyed. Some didn't understand all the politics, but they understood the feeling, the weight, the courage. When the lights came back on, one small girl raised her hand. "Miss, does he live far away?" The teacher nodded. "Yes, sweetie, very far." The girl looked down for a second, then whispered, "Maybe I can do something that matters too." The teacher smiled softly. "You already have." As dusk fell across continents, a quiet narration carried over scenes of people rebuilding schools, planting seeds, organizing town halls. The truth doesn't shout. It doesn't knock down doors. It waits, it watches, it whispers, and when it's finally heard, a pause. The sound of wind through trees. It echoes. Forever. In a world where power often silences truth, Ibrahim Traoré chose to speak not with rage but with courage. His quiet defiance reminded us that dignity doesn't come from status but from standing up when it's hardest. This story isn't just about politics. It's about choosing justice over comfort, choosing voice over silence, and choosing hope over fear. What would you do if your truth could shake the world? If this story touched you, don't let it stop here. Like, share and subscribe to Captain of Truth, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching Captain of Truth.